Thank you. I've just put up a few slides. Most people obviously haven't used slides, but I had a bit of visual sort of communication I wanted to highlight in the presentation. So I did that here. So the first thing I wanted to say is actually paraphrase something I continually said throughout the last governing term. And that was that national one major crisis or one major event away from the floor collapsing under their feet. And what I sort of mean by that is that for the first 2.5 years of the last 3-year term, National were doing pretty well. They were polling in the mid 40s, sometimes on a good day, the high 40s. But their leaders were polling poorly. Excuse me. They've had very few coalition partners, and their popularity was more based on their established brand than what they were, where they were going moving forward. So it was more on history than the future. And they weren't being very reflective as well in terms of why they had lost government in 2017. It was more sort of, we did everything right. We got more votes than anyone else. We're the largest party. And it was almost like the entitlement that they should still be in government. And people would realize that and vote for them again. More importantly, when it comes to COVID, is that they really didn't adapt to the post-COVID era. So even though they were sort of, as you can see in that picture on the top right, they were sort of polling in the mid 40s. Once COVID hit, they didn't sort of adapt to the new environment. So even though, for example, the Labour government's COVID mitigation strategy was very popular, polling in the mid 80s, for example, National still went on the attack on that particular issue, for example. And they still tried to maintain the same sort of brand that had sort of got them through in 2008 to 2017, very much based on sort of party unity and economic competence. So you can see that in those two middle images. But the problem is, as sort of highlighted in those two middle images, is the fact that they had, for example, 2 leadership changes in the space of a month. And on economic issues, just before their party conference, their campaign launch in 2020, there was a big $4.3 billion hole in their budget, their proposed budget, for example. And the Vote Compass data bears this out as well, where they had, for example, I would make it in sort of layman terms, the economic policy would get an F in terms of how aligned it was with public opinion. So they were going on this tax cuts, they were going on party unity, and they were going on attacking the government for their COVID mitigation strategy. And as a result, as you can see from the bottom right-hand slide here, they sort of started to drop in polling after COVID hit. They just didn't adapt to the post-COVID world. Labour, on the other hand, had spent a lot of the last 2.5 years before COVID hit lacking delivery. They'd sort of overpromised and underdelivered on things like housing, child poverty, infrastructure. They were polling in the late 30s, early 40s on a good day, but Ardern, as seen in the top left image here, was seen as very responsive and relatable. So that was sort of what was holding them up, so to speak, and it's sort of seen as their part of their success. But what was they did really well was in the post-COVID era, so March 2020 onwards, what we saw was how well they adapted. So they had the effective COVID-19 mitigation strategy, and everything became about COVID. Past failures, it was because of COVID. Future promises depends on COVID. Look at the Vote Compass data, for example. Even though they would get like a B+, aligning with public opinion on like a broad range of issues, they got it like an A+ on COVID. Like they did about as well as they possibly could, aligning with the public on COVID. So while Ardern was seen as responsive and relatable prior to COVID, there became the sort of competence aspect as well, where while Ardern's image was very much more based on what you see in that top left image, there was that more of a mixture because of daily press conferences and that sort of thing, of the competence and leadership that comes through with just being the Prime Minister and doing what the Prime Minister is sort of seen to, expected to do. We sort of saw that come through in the campaign as well, with a good mixture from Ardern of all of it very much COVID related, but that mixture of sort of being seen as a leader who is in touch with the public, as most obviously seen by the image on the top right, but also a strong leader being a prime minister, as sort of mixed in with that image on the top left, where it's sort of supposed to be like the prime minister's office, but at the same time it's a bit of a chat, as you can see from the cup of tea by around there. With Collins and the National Party, there was a lot more sort of isolation. So Collins was often sort of presented alone, or sort of surrounded by like basic blackened out surroundings. And what we sort of saw noticeably was the difference, as I said before, with the crowds, where Ardern would get swamped at shopping malls, which sort of highlighted sort of the how we'd beaten COVID basically, and that was sort of visual evidence of that everyone was able to gather in a crowd. While Collins, it was much more staged, and there was a lot less sort of crowds and interactions and that sort of thing, and a much more controlled sense of sort of leader in isolation, which didn't really play on the sort of post-COVID world, so to speak. So just to give it the sort of what that led to in the actual election in October of 2020, National lost 23 seats and in a swing in the party vote of 18.87%. Labour gained 13% and gained 19 seats. And they were the first party since MMP was introduced in 1996 to get an outright majority in government. So what does this actually mean in the broader perspective sense? What does this particular context, this particular election tell us about political marketing? Well, what we would basically argue, based on the sort of evidence of the election as a whole, is that it reinforces the importance of a market orientation, but a more targeted and focused one. So conducting and altering a product on the fly in the short term, doing so quickly, but around that focusing event, around that crisis. So making sure that they're aligned with the public on that particular issue, and that they're delivering on that issue and that sort of thing. So it sort of comes down to, I think it's Wynton Nelson's notion of an emergent strategy. So being more agile and thinking more in the short term. But that means you cannot maintain that sort of elongated market-oriented strategy that might sort of take an entire governing term to establish. In terms of branding, it can nullify a long-standing brand, as we saw with National, where they were seen as economically competent and sort of stable, and that just went right out the window with COVID. And in terms of delivery, similar sort of idea as I mentioned before, established theory around the importance of delivery for incumbents is less important. Public's laser-like focus on a crisis means that government's broader record is less important, and instead it's basically, again, concentrating on that one particular issue, right? So it sort of means that the governments are maybe less able to think in terms of the long-term impact of their potential strategy, for example. And then the final sort of thing I wanted to mention was around communication, just to go back to what I said before around Ardern maybe being seen as being seen as relatable and responsive to the public, but maybe less focused on sort of leadership, strength and competence prior to COVID. What we saw with COVID was this, what we call like a positive populist strategy, especially around communication, where there was still that sort of us versus them aspect of that sort of populism, but the us was the team of 5 million, and the them was COVID-19, which allowed the government to sort of mitigate the normal limitations that come from incumbency around sort of not being able to say, oh, things are terrible, we will fix it, which incumbents normally have trouble doing. They were able to do that because of COVID. And there was also a consistency in the communication that came through government crisis communication, social media communication, campaign communication, and then as you can see from the image on the left here, even social marketing, government social marketing. So there was a consistency and a sort of staying on message there across different platforms, across government communication, across public sector communication. It was very consistent. On the other hand, National tended to veer off into different subtopics. For example, a week before the actual election proper, Judith Collins got into a sort of subplot around who are obese people responsible for their situation, for example. That was just one example of that sort of lack of consistency in communication. And with that, I will say thank you.